Hi everyone, welcome to GMO Chess channel. After a few videos on different gambits and opening areas, I thought it would be nice to do a video on positional aspect of the game. I chose one of my favorite games played by Karpov against Yusupov, where he made some interesting decisions, and the overall game was basically a complete positional squeeze. Well, there is not a single tactic in the game. There is not many action going on like what we have seen in the other videos. But this game, like without any effort, Karpo would end up winning the game just based on simple positional decisions alone. So let's get started with our game with this position. The opening was the Queen's Indian defense, and after reaching this position, which is more or less a normal position in the opening. Apparently, Black's last move e5 was criticized, and apparently Bishop d4 instead of e5 would have been more precise. So this is the first interesting moment in the game. So thinking about this position, Knight c2 looks like a logical candidate move. Likewise, Knight c6 also looks pretty interesting. But the problem with Knight c6 is that Knight c6, Queen d7, you will have to trade off the knight on b8. Well, White spent 4 moves in this position to trade off this knight on b8, which hasn't even spent even a single move. Well, if you think about it, doesn't look logical at all. The knight on b8 hasn't even moved once. Well, Karpov chose this move to trade off the knight on b8 in this position after e5. Well, knight c2 is a natural follow-up in this position, but after that, like I'm sure, like Black would also continue with some natural course of development with knight d7, g6, bishop g7, and f5. And White can claim a small advantage, but nothing substantial. But what's the point of trading off this knight on b8? Well, if you ask your coach, he will be like, if you make such a decision, I'm sure like your coach is not going to be happy at all with the decision. In general, like you don't spend like 4 or 5 moves to trade off an undeveloped piece in your opponent's position. It doesn't make sense at all. But if Karpov is doing it, certainly he knows what he is doing, and he has a very clear plan about about this exchange basically. So here it starts. The first move, h4. So to understand the overall aspect, the idea of this exchange and the follow-up plan that White has here is that now, since all the pawns are fixed in the dark squares in the center, the bishop on f6 is obviously a bad bishop. Now, the good bishop for Black is the bishop on b7. Now, if you think about it, there are 2 ways in which the bishop on b7 can get activated itself. One is the c6 move, the other one is with the bishop c8 plan. I think both these moves are pretty much possible. Now with h4, all that White does is, if he sees the bishop on c8, he wants to trade off the bishop on c8 the moment the bishop comes out. Otherwise, the bishop on g2 will be waiting for the bishop to, waiting for Black to play c6 in this position so that he can trade off that right away. And at the same time, the bishop on f6 will still remain as a bad bishop. So from here it starts. Slowly, White will keep improving his position. So many moves before White ends up winning the game. But if you think about it, it's all logical and very simple once you understand the concept. Black played a5, and White immediately stopped Black's expansion with a4. Stopping all this a4, b5 expansion, there is nothing that Black can do. If at all there is any pawn break that Black has, that is only with c6, and c6 more or less only is going to help White get what he wants in this position, because now d6 pawn can also become a clear weakness in this position, a clear target for the White's pieces to attack. Now Black obviously wouldn't do that. Black tried to create some counterplay with rook f8, and he wants to expand after moving the bishop on f6 with f5. e4, another important move. In this case, White is not afraid of c6 anyways, because after d6, d6 is going to be a clear target for the White's pieces. So that's not a problem. Black played h5. Long castle, because Sooner or later, white wants to expand on the king side and begin the attack on the black king there. Logical. G6, bishop h3. And basically, the bishop on h3 is going to do nothing else apart from waiting for the bishop on b7 to come out and trade that off. And once that is done, white's going to have a good knight against the bad bishop position. A very simple and easy position for the white side to play. White continues to improve his position. King c2, king g7, f3. Like, this is one of the typical things that you will find in Karpov's game. He'll make small subtle improvements. He'll not try to immediately go out for the action. Like, for example, in this position, if white wants to build the attack g4 or f4, no, there is no need to really rush. White can improve his position to the fullest extent before he starts the attack, and before he went f4, white would play like at least like another 10-15 moves. Let's keep going with that. f3, rook h8, rook h2, bishop a6, provoking b3, but it doesn't matter. White went out with knight b5, not fearing bishop b5 and entering the opposite color bishop endgame, because now c7 is a clear target for the white's pieces. Now after moving the king, white will start piling up against the c7 pawn. He'll triple up and hit on c7. If necessary, even if black defends the c7 pawn with the bishop, I'm sure like an exchange sacrifice is definitely there in such positions. Now, black continued with rook f8, king b1, queen d8, like few moves, maneuvering moves back and forth. And eventually black came out with bishop c8, because sooner or later you have to do that. Like always, any other bishop on a6 is doing nothing there anyways. Bishop c8, queen c8, rook g1, bishop d8. And he decided knight's optimal placement is on c6, at least for the time being, stopping all the c6 pawn break. At the same time, in case there is anything, the knight can really like keep the pressure on the e5 pawn, especially when white achieves f4 pawn break. And also it will aid in the central pawn break with e4, e5 after the f4 pawn break is achieved. So a few more preparatory moves for the f4 pawn break, which is the final pawn break. Once the f4 is done, the pieces are going to come into contact. So white has to be 100% ready for this. And when the time was right, went out with f4. Now black continued with queen g4. Queen f3, exchange of queens is definitely useful, because once the exchange is done, white's position remains super safe, very solid. And white's going to play for two results without any difficulties. So rook e8, queen g4, pawn takes, and f5. And black anyway relies in the solidity of this position. He just wants to close down everything and achieve a draw. If you think about it, white still keeps a lot of chances in this position. Especially look at this g4 pawn. If at all there is anything, he could simply play knight a7, knight b5, knight c3, knight d1, knight e3, and go after the g4 pawn. Black cannot save that. But okay, one can argue that even that doesn't really help him. Like, I mean, winning the g4 pawn doesn't matter. Anyway, this doesn't make any... it's not really useful for black anyways. The presence of the pawn on g4 is nothing anyways. So white continues with an alternate plan. King c2 followed by doubling up of the rooks on the a file happens, because white wants to achieve b4 and open up the position, and black is getting ready to meet that. White went out with b4 and king f8, and here you look at another interesting idea, b5. After rook a7, now black's idea is very simple. Black is expecting knight a7, and after h6, bishop h8 and h7, he would simply play f6 as well. And as you can see, this is exactly not going to be useful for white to convert the position into a win. Like somehow the position is super solid and somehow he can hold on this position. This is black's idea. Still, white has a pawn break on c5, he has rook g6, rook g8. It's not going to be easy at all. But something like this, like black is hoping for a draw. Nevertheless, the a7 rook can be taken anytime. So white went with h6, bishop h8. And white played one more small improvement, f6, so that he can open up the lines for the rook to join the attack in case black takes on f6, which is what happened in the game. So bishop takes f6 was met with rook f1, bishop h8, and he took the rook, followed by rook h5. As you can see, black cannot play f6 because of rook g5. and king e7, and now basically the damage is done. White rooks are getting into black's camp, and somewhere here, yeah, black gave up at this point. So if you guys think about it, the decision that he made at this point when he played knight b8, the whole idea looked a little dubious for white side, but in the hindsight, it looked like Karpov's idea was probably the best plan, and everything becomes clear after a few moves. So the whole idea was to play against the bishop on b7 and dominate the bishop on f6 with e4, and putting all the pawns in the light squares and controlling the light squares basically. So I guess an amazing game played by Karpov. I'm sure you all learned something useful. So I'll see you all in another video then. Thank you everyone.